Booktube, welcome back to my channel. It's been a while, but today I'm finally here to talk about my experience judging the 2020 Booktube Prize. If you're new to my channel or if you haven't heard about the Booktube Prize before, it is as it sounds, booktubers judging what we consider to be the best book that was published in the previous year. Last year, Robert from Barter Horde started this prize, and this year he's already expanded the field and extended the scope of the prize. In that last year, we only had fiction contenders. This year, we have both fiction and non-fiction. In order for a book to have been eligible, it had to have been published between January 1st and December 31st in 2019. And for fiction books, it had to have been a novel originally published in English. I don't think there were any other criteria. But in any case, I've signed up to be a judge for both fiction and nonfiction, but I'm going to be doing that in alternating rounds. So in the first Octofinals round, I was a judge for the fiction group and I was judging group C. So I had 6 books to judge, and they were Where Reasons End by Yi-Yun Lee, A Woman Is No Man by Ita Fromm, Frankenstein by Jeanette Winterson, Spring by Ali Smith, The Far Field by Madhuri Vijay, and one more, Inland by Thea Obrecht. And I had already read The Far Field by Madhuri Vijay. That was a book that I read last year. So going into the Octofinals round, I had 5 additional books to read. And because I had really enjoyed The Far Field when I read it, I was looking to see which book would measure up. And I could give you a spoiler here, but I won't. You'll have to go through the whole video with me to see how I ranked the books. In general, I didn't like all the books that I read. In fact, there were so many similarities between the books that it felt like I was reading one book the whole time because there were so many overlapping storylines. There were two books that had parents whose children had died, and they were keeping up conversations with their children supernaturally. There was also an instance of another parent who was talking to their child even though their child wasn't present, but in that case the parent and child were estranged. And so those 3 storylines felt like they were very similar. There were instances of supernatural beings and people seeing or having, what should I say? People who were clairvoyants, people who were seeing they didn't call them dead, they called them living, the other living. Yeah. That happened in more than one book, and I just wasn't quite a fan. There was also discussion of word etymology, and that carried over in 1, 2, 3 of the books. And while that is a subject that I like to read about, it just felt like so many of the books were so similar. And ultimately, I feel like I rewarded books that were different, books that went above and beyond and gave me a different kind of story rather than just what felt like the same plot over and over. So 6 books to choose from. Here's how I ranked them. The first book that I read, which I told you I read before, was The Far Field by Madhuri Vijay, and the storyline in that one is a young woman in India. Her mother has died, and she's trying to reconcile the loss of her parent with kind of revisiting her childhood, revisiting moments that she shared with her mother. And part of that childhood is that there was a man who used to visit their home and had a relationship with her mother. And while she didn't think, at least at the outset, that it had become a romantic kind of love, she knew that that experience had really changed her mother. And so after her mother's death, she decides to try to find this man who used to visit her home. And so she travels to his hometown of Kashmir and becomes involved in the politics of Kashmir, even though she's from Bangalore. And there is a discussion of religion and religious identity, but also the politics of India, because the main character is Hindu and she's trying to understand more about the Muslims, or is it the other way around? In any case, there is discussion of the religious identity. And because she's a young woman and she's been sheltered for most of her life, there's a lot that is going on around her that she is unaware of and unprepared to be responsible for. I really enjoyed the way the author brought the reader into the mind of the main character And so we experience the main character's naivety, we experience her innocence, and also her failings along with her, just because from the fact that she hasn't been exposed to the harshness of life. She's just unprepared to be responsible for herself or for any other person's life or future. And so I really appreciated the, what's the word? I appreciated the way the author brought me into that main character's life and experiencing her failings along with her. I'll think about another way to say this later after this video is finished. But in general, I really appreciated that book, and so I gave it high ratings. And going into the round, I knew that this was the book that I wanted to see if other books would measure up to. The second book I read was A Woman is No Man by Ita Fromm, and the author is a Palestinian American who wanted to write a book for people like her. And so she talked about the tragedy of arranged marriages, and she gave us a dual timeline, dual perspective look at the life of a woman who experiences an arranged marriage. And because of the trauma and the tragedy of her life and the tragedy of her marriage, she wants to save her daughters from that same experience, but she finds herself impotent to do anything about it, because in the culture, whether you grow up in Palestine or you grew up in America, in the Palestinian American society, arranged marriages is still the norm, and it's a very patriarchal society, and so women don't have the ability to really say too much about what their destiny is. I thought that was a really interesting story. However, I didn't feel like it was well written enough to be awarded the Booktube prize. So even though it was a story that pulled me in, and I was happy that I read the book, I felt emotionally connected to the characters at some point, I really didn't feel like the book warranted moving on to the next round, and so I didn't rank it very high. The next book I read was Spring by Alice Smith. And if you're new to Alice Smith's writing, she's been working on a quartet that is named after the seasons. This latest installment is Spring. And in the previous books, as well as in this book, she talks a lot about current events, not just the events that are happening in the United Kingdom, which is where Alice Smith is living and writing, I think, but world politics. She talks about refugees moving from elsewhere in the world and coming to the United Kingdom and the United States seeking refugee status, and how it impacts their lives and destinies, but also how it impacts the people who are living in those countries where they're accepting refugees, or really maybe not accepting them, but allowing them to come in and putting them in detention centers. And so she uses that look at refugees and immigration to talk about how our lives are being affected on a global level. In this book, we had an older man who has lost a friend, and he's continuing to think about the impact that this woman had on his life in a professional sense, but he's also having conversations with his daughter. And this is a book where the man is estranged from his daughter, and the friend who was his colleague had advised him to visit places as he would with his real life daughter if he saw her, but to visit them solo, but to bring his imaginary child. How do I explain this? He should have an imaginary relationship with his real life daughter even though he can't see her. And so every time, is my baby crying? Why is she crying? Is her father going to be able to keep her? Is everything okay? Okay, so this man, and I don't remember names anymore. His name is Richard. So our main character Richard, he has a friend named Paddy, and they were friends but also work colleagues. And he's some kind of a producer or director, but he's estranged from his wife and real life daughter. And because he isn't there to see his daughter grow up. His friend slash coworker advises him to continue having a relationship with his daughter, even if it's an imaginary one. So he should go around the world, go to places and see things and imagine how his real life daughter would experience it if she was there, and to report back. And so he's had a really strong connection to this friend slash coworker for their time together. And now that she has died, he's reflecting on their relationship. He's reflecting on how she has affected his life. And that's very interesting because we know that he is capable of carrying on imaginary relationships with people who he knew but doesn't know anymore. And so that became a very interesting storyline for me. The book is also very literary because there is lots, well, Alice Smith in general talks a lot about word origins and how word origins impact us. Words that seem like or sound like something, and where those words come from and what their meanings suggest. When we think about word meanings, what does that mean on a bigger level for us? I really appreciated also the look that she gave on the children who are growing up in the detention centers, these places where refugees have risked their life and limb to leave their countries of origin and come to the promised world, the promised land, the new world, hoping for a better life, and instead being placed in these detention centers. And so in this book, she talked a lot about origin, word origin, but also people's origins and what happens to them after there is change. I found this book to be so interesting on that level. There were flaws. Alice Smith's writing can get a little scattered because it feels like it's not cohesive. We're moving back and forth between following one person, following another person. And there is some kind of a storyline that we're not sure whether it's real or imaginary. But ultimately, I thought that that was a really good look at movement and life, because life is not chronological. Well, I guess it is. Time is chronological. But our lives are not, because we move back and forth between experiences. And I feel like in that way, Smith captures a lot of what life is in her fiction. And so I rated that pretty highly as well. So we're halfway through Farfield, Spring, and A Woman is No Man. The fourth book that I read was the fourth book that I read was Where Reasons End by Yi Yun Lee, and I listened to an audiobook version of this one because I was on hold at the library for a really long time, and then I got my hold ebook to read, print, and I missed the date to read it, and so then I had to get the audiobook version from Audible. So I actually ended up buying this book. And I regret that because it's not a book that I enjoy, and I don't think that I'll re-listen to it. I didn't like a lot of things about this one. This is an autobiographical novel, I suppose. Our author, Yi Yun Lee, in her real life has a son who committed suicide as a teenager. And so she's writing a book about a middle-aged female writer whose son commits suicide at 16. And she's carrying on conversations with him where she's remembering their past, their shared past, but also imagining who he is now and having conversations with him where he critiques her writings, and opines about other people's rememberings of him. And so I felt like this story was limited just in the fact that even though we're hearing from this son, we're hearing from him later. We're hearing from him through her words, through her telling of it, because the fact that she is the person having the conversation with her son, even if he is not gone, we, the reader, are not really being treated to his words, except that they're being censored by what she's reporting. And I felt like the fact that she wrote, so the dialogue goes, A, B, C, D, I said, F, G, H, I, J, K, he said, L, M, N, O, P, I said, Q, R, S, T, U, V, he said. And I'm using alphabet because baby, going through the alphabet with her. But what I'm saying is that there's this alternating he said and she said, which I found to be just so distracting. I didn't love this book. I didn't love the plot. I didn't like the writing style. I didn't love the fact that I didn't feel like I liked the main character at any point in this story. So that was a low rating for me. The fifth book that I read was Inland by Theo O'Brett, which I alternated between liking and not liking. The storyline in this one is dual perspective, and we're following two main characters. One of the main characters is a boy. We meet him as a boy. His mother died and his father died, and he grew up in a kind of Dickensian way where he becomes an orphan and is kind of farmed out to work for his keep. And eventually he runs away and joins up with a gang and takes on this name. His name is now Luri Mati. And he's of Middle Eastern descent, so people call him the Turk. But what's interesting is that later in his life, well, over the course of our experience with him, he turns to a life of crime almost. And he commits a violent crime against a boy who later dies, and so he becomes a wanted man, and he's essentially making his way out west, escaping the law. And one of the people, part of his experience is that he encounters and befriends and starts to be accompanied by a camel, in the United States. And his part of the novel is being written as a letter to this camel named Burke. The other storyline is we're following a middle-aged woman named Nora, and she and her husband have been living on a homestead out west, and they're seeking water because it's one of the things, you live in these homesteads, you are really prone to what the environmental issues are. And she had a daughter who died, so she's another person who's having a conversation with her child who's dead. But for most of the novel, her husband is gone and her two older sons have gone to try to look for him. Her husband is a newspaper man, and so he's been publishing articles that are exposing some of the corruption that is happening in their community. And because this book is happening in the late 1800s, we're having discussions about women's rights and women's suffrage and how women are treated in relationships by their husbands and also other people in the society. But we're also seeing not just the politics, but we're also seeing the environmental issues. And part of the failing for me with this book, even though I really liked some things about it and I thought it was really good in terms of its literary endeavors, it felt like the two storylines were two lines that were converging. They weren't really parallel lines because they weren't always equidistant apart. They were coming together at some point, but it felt like like they were so almost parallel that it was taking forever for them to get to that point of convergence, and it was just difficult because I didn't always feel like I understood what was going to happen. And even in the end, when the story ended, it was an unsatisfactory end because I didn't feel like the stories converged enough. So while I like some things about the book, I didn't love it. And I didn't give it as high a rating as I probably could have if the ending had been different. And so the final book I read was Frankenstein by Jeanette Winterson. And I've never read anything by Jeanette Winterson. I've heard that her books are racy and sensual, and this one is no different. Frankenstein is kind of a retelling or a retake on Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. And in this one, we are talking about artificial intelligence, and not just artificial intelligence, but artificial sensuousness, because again, there are two storylines in this one. One is that we're following Mary Shelley as she comes up with the storyline of Frankenstein, but we also have a present day storyline with a lot of the people with the same names. And in this modern day, now we're talking about robots and using robots for sensual and erotic pleasure. And man, I did not like that storyline, but I felt like it was more literary than other books, and so I rated it higher than I probably would have. I rated it higher because the book was literary, not because I enjoyed it. So ultimately, my rating was a little scattered, but I'm just going to tell you the books that I chose as my number 1, 2, and 3 books were The Far Field by Medora Vijay, which is still, I consider, the best of these 6 books, and I'm still hoping that The Far Field wins the Booktube prize. My second rank was Spring by Alice Smith, and my third rank was Frankenstein by Jeanette Winterson. And I really hope that that book does not come back around to bite me in a future round, because I do not want to reread that book. But I thought it was literary enough to advance to the next round. My bottom books were Inland by Thea Obrecht, A Woman is No Man by Etta Fromm, and Where Reasons End by Yoon Lee. So those are my 1, 2, 3, and my 4, 5, and 6 books. If you want to talk with me any further about these books, I'd love to chat with you. I'm going to now post my reviews of these books on Goodreads, and I've also written a blog post where I discuss these books a little bit more detail and show you the 6 criteria, the 6 questions that I use as criteria to judge the books. I'll share that with you in my blog post as well. So I'll link that down below when I have posted it. It's not posted yet, so it probably won't go up when this video goes up. But for now, this is how I ranked the Booktube Prize Octofinals Group C. I'd love to chat with you in the comments if you are a judge, or if you love book prizes and would like to chat with me a little bit more, or again, if you read any of these books and you had different opinions on them, I'd love to chat with you there, because I am open to hearing that I judge these books unfairly. Sure, tell me about that in the comments. I'd love to hear what you've been reading. And until next time, happy reading. Stay safe. Bye.